Greetings, friends! Waningrisky here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukraine war update for the week of April 7th through April 13th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine war updates, be sure to subscribe my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share this video around. And we're going to start for this week in the Tourette's direction. And it seems like for one of the main areas the Russians are going to focus on is the Tourette's direction. As we know, for the last almost 2 months, it seems like the Ukrainians are actually on the initiative on this area. After the Russians allegedly took Tourette's, they've been doing multiple reconnaissance missions into Touretsk, burying themselves in the residential areas of Touretsk and basically giving the Russians a hard time. However, now it is the Russians' turn to give the Ukrainians a hard time, and the hardest part where the Russians are giving them a hard time is in this area between Minograd and Touretsk, this area right here. And it seems like this is where the Russians are pushing very hard. We talked about last week about the fall of Alexandropol and Pantamanovka. As you know, guys, I cannot spell these or pronounce these for shit. But anyway, one of the biggest areas is the Russians are now pushing here, and not only that, they made some sort of major breakthrough and managed to completely capture the village of Kalynove. We have footage of the Russians raising their flags in this area right here. And we don't have exact geolocating confirmation just yet, but most mappers, even pro-Ukrainian mappers, have show that Kalynove has fallen. Now, as you know, this was one of the main, after the fall of Arkhangelsk, Karamik, and Orcheshny almost a year ago, the Ukrainians fell back to Kalynove and were basically, using positions, in their on their eastern flank with the defenses in Alexandropol and then their defenses near Zelianopol and Baranovka in the west to basically have a new front line that basically protected, this area for almost a year. But now, with the Russians breaking through here near Tarasovka, with the Russians breaking through towards Sukha-Balka, it was just a matter of time before they broke through the main Ukrainian defense in Kalynove and completely captured this village. And because once this center defense fell, the Ukrainians fell back to Star Mykolaievka, and it seems like actually after the actual main line of defense the Ukrainians are now putting up is near the village of Zorania, this area right here. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians start storming Star Mykolaievka and take it very soon. Because the Russians have basically broken through the first line of defense for the Ukrainians, and not only that, they're making rapid progress. In the east here, the Russians have captured a lot of these fields to the west here, took these fields. And so this helps Russia secure their gains here. And if the Russians are in Kalynove, one of the main, if you look at where the trenches are, the Ukrainians have a bunch of trenches along this line here from Kalynove to Sukha-Balka. So if the Russians could somehow take this tree line under their control, they'll be in a very solid position to start storming Star Mykolaievka. One of my guesses is the Russians are going to do some sort of offense. If I was the Russians, like they say, from what I see, they would accumulate in the city of New York, which has a lot of urban development, so they could hide a lot of forces here. And then they could do a major offensive towards Sukha-Balka. Taking Sukha-Balka would actually secure their flank here and actually allow them to take Star Mykolaievka and force Ukrainians back up to Zoria. So I could expect to see some battles for this Sukha-Balka very soon. But yeah, I do expect to see battles for this, and the Russians will basically try to take something like this, and then they'll start storming Star Mykolaievka. But they also need to secure their eastern flank, or their western flank, and this is what they're doing as well. Most map updates have changed and show that this area has been captured by the Russians. So everything, some fields to the east of Zelianopolia. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians also continue pushing this way and try to take more of these fields around this area as well. And then so if you look at the global scope of what the Russians are going to try to do here, the Russians will take something like this. And then from here, the Russians will then try to storm Star Mykolaievka, try to maybe push up through this highway, try to take some of these fields, and then storm Star Mykolaievka, and then storm these fields to the south here from their positions here, and then take Star Mykolaievka, and then from two pincers, and then from here, the Russians will be in a very strong position to then assault the next Ukrainian fortification. So the breakthrough in Kalynove, the breakthrough towards Sukha-Balka is just one step for the Russians to continue breaking through towards the main goal, which is to reach the Kiblin-Bilk water reservoir here, reaching Alexandra Kalynove, because once the Russians reach this area right here, they'll be able to start cutting off Konstantinovka from the west here. because once they reach that, what the Russians will probably do, as the Russians do in an offensive to reach this red line, is that the Russians are going to try to finally finish the battle for Chasiv Yar and clear it, and clear this little like sack right here as they're pushing into this area right here. And then from here, this would allow them to cut off Konstantinovka from the south and cut off Konstantinovka from the east here. And the only road will be this road in the north of Konstantinovka. So the Russians will do the tried and true tactic of surrounding Konstantinovka on 3 directions and try to squeeze the Ukrainians out of here. So the main goal here, I think, for the summer will be Konstantinovka. With the, so if I had to guess the Russian summer offensive plans here, it'll be something like this. Take something like this. So everything, if they could take this up to this red line for the summer campaign, then they would have done a good job in this direction. So yeah, there's that. The Russians are also making rapid progress in the east here a little bit. They're also, and we talked about this before the Pokrovsk-Minigrad operation kind of grinded to a halt because the Ukrainians are also counterattacking here. But I always talked about how if the Russians advance here to secure their flanks here, this could also serve as to encircle Minigrad from the east. And so it looks like that's what the Russians are doing. We saw a major GLK confirmation of the Russians doing a major attack here, where they got bombarded around these fields, and then we got confirmation from the Russian Ministry of Defense that they took the village of Yezheletivka. This village probably got razed to the ground already, so it's probably symbolic. So there's like one road here with like a few houses, but in any case, this would secure their position a little bit, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians probably try to move up towards the village of Mirolubivka, Mykolaievka, Malinovka, Myrnia, and try to basically cut. Finally, if we kind of look at the bigger picture here, is the Russians will probably try to take something like this, line themselves along these rivers here and these reservoirs for better defense, and then this would allow them to start, basically encircle Minigrad from the east here, and then they could see what they do from here. So there's a lot of potential for this direction if the Russians are successful here. Now, in Toretsk itself, there's actually been a lot of interesting things the Russians are doing in the Toretsk direction itself. One of the biggest things is the Russians did a major offensive here. We actually we never really see this, where the Russians do big penetrative pushes, and we actually saw the Russians in the village of Nilopolivka here. Now, I guess that the Russians weren't able to actually secure themselves here. If they did, that would be we still don't know the results of that. My guess is that the Russians weren't able to secure their positions here. Maybe it was just a distraction. But if they did, this would be the fact they were able to reach this village of Nilopolivka shows how if they actually do a coordinated attack and they could actually break into Ukrainian defense lines, and then they just have to be a little bit less sloppy about it. It's not just getting in there. It's about getting behind enemy lines, breaking and then so if the Russians were using this highway, is they would use multiple drop-off points. Maybe drop-off units here, drop-off units, in these trenches right here, and then also drop-off units in Nipolivka, and then maybe drop-off units, in this rail line right here or something. And then, with that, then you could do a big push and try to break the, because if if the Ukrainians see that the Russians are behind them, they're like, oh shit, and then that is how you actually break the deadlock here. They were just a little sloppy, and they just did one massive Leora Jenkins moment. So, but this does prove that the Russians in the northern part of Toretsk are now securing themselves a lot better. I'm very interested to see the status of this little factory right here, this little industrial zone. If the Russians could take this would secure the northern flank of, or at least have a very strong position to continue their offensive towards Kylianbalka and Katerinovka. But we don't have any GLK confirmation of the results of that massive attack. But we'll see what happens. Where the Russians are also pushing is to secure their gains in these fields to the north of Toretsk as well. We have GLK confirmation of the Russians taking some of these more of these residential areas to the north of Krimsky, which I think is just part of Toretsk anyway, so to the south of this area. We have more GLK confirmation of the Russians taking some of these tree lines here. And we also have some, the Russians trying to take some of these trenches that are on the other side of this canal here. The main goal here probably is to take, from here, is to, my guess, is to take everything like this. If they could take something like this would, secure their northern flank for a tremendous degree here, and actually secure their gains in Toretsk. If they could follow this up with, if the Russians did an attack here and secured this little industrial zone as well, and then they could probably try to storm the Ukrainian trenches, which they have a very fortified positions on this hill. Because if you look down here, you actually can see a lot of trenches here. Yeah, you can see a bunch of trenches that the Ukrainians set up here. So you could take this area here by outflanking them from Dolinovka. The Russians will be in a very strong position to actually secure their gains in Toretsk. So something like this. And then obviously from here, then the Russians will try to attack to the west here and try to take Kalynove, Katerinovka, and finally take Sherebeki and Novospatska. Again, the main goal here, again, is to push up to this water reservoir in the Toretsk direction. So the main goal, if you took everything into account, is something like this. That is the goal of the Russians. And this, as you can see from this, this would put the Russians right up until Konstantinovka, and then obviously these battles will take a while. It might take a few months. It might take 2 or 3 months or so. But in the meantime, the Russians in Chasiv Yar could then, use that time to break through and, maybe take, these fields as well, and then, push up until, up to the right, up against Konstantinovka. Maybe do an offensive towards Alexia Drusovka to cut off Konstantinovka from the north. So yeah, the Toretsk direction is where the action is happening. I am looking forward to see how the Russians continue their offensive in the south here, in this kind of pocket here, and see how they continue their offensive out of Toretsk. Alrighty, now we're going to go, actually, let's go to Pokrovsk, actually. Let's go to Pokrovsk. Now, this is also another area where the Russians are now back on the offensive. Not as spectacular as the Toretsk direction, but it is something worth talking about, because this is where the Ukrainians used to also give the Russians a hard time, just like in Toretsk. And so this is where the Russians are basically trying to regain what they lost. And one of the biggest things is that we have geolocated confirmation that the Russians in Udachin and Kotlin are in very secure, or not very secure, but are back in these positions. I thought they would have to give up Udachin and Kotlin, but it looks like the Russians are very much still in these positions. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being on this farm right here, this area right here. So this does prove that the Russians are probably in control of something like this. I think we also have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this little area right here. So if the Russians are here, this could give them a very good position to hold in Koltuna. So it looks like the Ukrainians are not in control of Koltuna, and it looks like the Russians are back in control here. Not only that, we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the eastern part of Udachna in these residential areas right here. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians are still in control of this little industrial zone. So it looks like the Russians are still holding on to their positions in Udachna and are liquid. And, again, as mentioned, they also liquidated the Ukrainian positions near Solonia after their attack here. The Russians managed to push the Ukrainians out of Uspenivka, but I do kind of question that. I do wonder if Uspenivka is still this kind of gray zone here, because it got flattened to the fucking ground. But in any case, it looks like the Russians in this kind of salient here are very much protected, and they're basically, as much, they're not expanding. It's not like they've completely captured Udachna or they are now paddling for this Pokrovsk, factory. But so it's not like they're expanding their positions per se. It's that they're in a lot more better position to hold their gains here. And then if we move to, and then also the Russians, held back, are improving their positions here. The Russians are, have completely taken the northern part of Listovka, and this just secures their kind of flank between Novigorivka and Shentemivka. So just holding this line between Pokrovsk and Nemigrad would, and taking Listovka is also another thing the Russians are expanding their positions on. And then in this kind of these fields towards the Dnipro Oblast, the Russians are also making rapid progress. Also, apologies for my if I'm still I'm not sick anymore like last week, but I have I still have those post sick snorts and all that, when you're just filled with snot and shit. In any case, so sorry about that, but we shall continue. Anyway, so this week, the Russians are continue pushing towards the Dnipro Oblast. Most Russian sources are saying that they have completely captured the village Toretska, and this makes sense. It is just a one-street village, and now the Ukrainians fell back to the village of Gorokovko, the last village before they reached the Dnipro Oblast. And along with this, the Russians are about to storm the village of Kotorinovka, so a lot of Russians are saying they took all these fields to the east of Kotorinovka and are about to storm this little farmstead here, which will give them a little position to hold on to. And then so once they storm this, the positions will kind of look like this. They've also taken Bogdanovka, and then from here, then they could then continue pushing and the main goal will then also be to take this village and then start reaching Novopalovka, which is the main goal for the Russians in this direction. The Russians are also pushing in the south of Bogdanovka. They have taken a lot of these fields to the south, to the south of Bogdanovka. This helps the Russians because if they could continue pushing on these fields, the Russians could be in a very good position to start storming the village of Oleshka, which, is the south Donetsk direction. But yeah, so this area, one of the things that I think that will help the Russians secure Udachna is that once they take, Katarinovka, that instead of storming Novopalovka, I do think they're going to start pushing north towards the Solonia River to try to take the villages of Nova Alexandrivka, Nova Sigirivka, Nova Mykolaievka, Moravka, and then, they could also then push out of Uspenivka and then push from these directions and then take something like this. Because from here, then they could just use the river as a guide and then reach the northern part of Novopalovka. And from here, this would also allow the Russians to take more of these fields to the south of Udachna, which will also facilitate them being able to capture Udachna. So the goal here would be something like this. Just kind of reach the Dnieper Oblast and such. And this would, secure their, kind of their western flank a lot better. So yeah, there a lot of progress in this area, and the Russians managed to pause any Ukrainian progress and roll them back here. So a lot of both in Pokrovsk and Terez, the Russians are making gains and are now back on the offensive. Where the Russians have been on the offensive and the Ukrainians have not been able to push them back is in the south Donetsk direction, and this is where the Russians are also making progress and is an area that is not quiet, even though they took their Karakova and Velika Nosovka. They are still active here, trying to reach the rest of the Donetsk Oblast in the south Donetsk direction. From this area, one of the biggest things is that the Russians are pushing through these fields towards the villages of Baratar and Ordania. The Russians managed to take a bunch of these fields to the to the north of Rozdonovka, to the south of Ordania. The Russians could probably make some sort of big push to try to take Ordania, because if they could take this village and hold it, this will cut off one of the main supplies to Baratar. This could probably happen in conjunction with the Russian offensive towards Elisivka. And I talked about this last week, but then this would very much complicate the Ukrainian positions on Baratar, which is one of the last major defenses before the Ukrainians have to fall back towards Novopalovka in here. This would also put very much pressure on Kamar as well, which is another major objective for the Russians in this direction. But yeah, so the capturing these fields and just pushing, just as they push towards Rosal from the south here, is just one tree line at a time as they reach Ordania. So yeah, but a lot of advances to the north here, which also secures their positions as they move along the Molkaya River here. Speaking of this area, the Russians are now reaching the outskirts of Shentevko. We have GLK confirmation of the Russians basically taking all these fields right to the eastern part of Shentevko. So we probably should expect to see battles for this village soon. My guess also is a lot of pro-Russians are saying the Russians are already storming the southern part of Fedorovka. I do expect to see maybe some Russians trying to push out of Isola to take some of these, more of these tree lines to the north of Shentevko, which I think where the Russians will try to focus on. And then, the main goal here is to take the village of Linopolia and Shentevko. And I talked about this last week, but, something like this. I'm still surprised the Russians have not taken Vilina Maybe it's like, it's a bit of a bigger village and, all these other villages, so, the Russians can't accumulate for a massive push. But it is, this is something they have to take if they want to secure their positions here a little bit. So, but taking Shentevko and Vilina is one of the main goals here for the Russians. But yeah. And then now we're going to talk about the Zaporozhye direction. The Russians are still making moves to take the village of Kamyanska. They basically took a bunch of fields on their way to Kamyanska. They took some of these fields here, some of these fields between Snopova and Lobkovka. So as you can see, they're just kind of improving their positions a little bit to start storming Kamyanska. I do think the Russians will probably try to take the southern part. Kamyanska is kind of divided by a river, and this was where their front line was for a while. So I do think the Russians will probably take the southern part of Kamyanska soon. And then from here, the Russians will then try to storm some of these positions here to start storming Kamyanska from the north here. But I do think the southern part of Kamyanska is the main goal here for right now. But yeah. So just a little bit of improvements around the fields here. We shall see how the Russians develop their offensive in the Zaporozhye direction. Alrighty, now we're going to continue going, and we're going to now talk about the Chasiv Yar direction. The Chasiv Yar direction is somewhere where the Russians are slowly but surely gnawing at the main Ukrainian defenses in the center part of Chasiv Yar, which the battle's been going on here for a large while. But seems like the tide is now turning. The Russians have made a lot of progress in the central part. I still don't know why the Russians don't just hurry up and take it. Maybe the map is not as we see, because if you look at the map here, it looks like the Russians have basically cut off the central part, and there's like basically no way to supply it except through this forest here, which doesn't have a road. But it does show that but maybe it's not as tenuous as the hold is not as strong as we think. In any case, the Russians are trying to take central Chasiv Yar because this would allow them to have the dominant height position, and then this would allow them to deflect a lot of Ukrainian attacks. So they are pushing into Chasiv Yar. So from the north here, we have the Russians taking over this this area right here, these areas right here. So this kind of train station and this area and these buildings right here. So in the north, they're expanding their presence in the north of Chasiv Yar here. So they're breaking, and I could expect them to continue pushing along this lake here, try to take some of these fields here to just cut off this area. Also, we have the Russians. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being around the stadium. So the Russians have taken some of these buildings and the hospital around the stadium. And then in this area, the Russians are also pushing into the center of Chasiv Yar and have captured some more of these buildings in the center here. So as you can see, the entire central Chasiv Yar is just a bunch of high-rise buildings, and so this is a very fortified area. I'm not surprised why it took so long, but the Ukrainians here have been cut off for a while, so I don't know why the Russians don't make a final dash just to liquidate it, because the Ukrainians are gathering for attack in Chasiv Yar to try to push the Russians out of here. And so if they could hold on to the center part, then it'll be the Ukrainians that will have to battle up a hill to defeat them, which will be very hard. But in any case, the Russians are making very slow and steady progress, taking piecemeal by piecemeal in the center of Chasiv Yar, but hopefully they could take it, by the end of April, and then, secure the rest of these areas here. The Ukrainians, we also have geolocated confirmation. The Ukrainians are a bit more secure and, have taken some of these forest area right here, so they're in a bit of a better position in the south than we assumed. So my assumption is that there is this area is like a bit of a gray zone here, and that these residential areas, and so that's why it's it's a bit more fluid than the map would suggest, and that's probably why the Ukrainians are able to supply Chasiv Yar a bit better. So yeah, we shall see if the Russians can finally end the battle for Chasiv Yar. Now let us go to the Seversk direction, where the Russians are continuing battling for I forgot what they call it, Milogoria Hill. But anyway, they have to take this hill in order to actually secure Grigorivka and Verkhomanyanska. This is the dominant hill in this area. And, it's not sexy. It's not saying, oh, I captured a hill. So the Russian they changed the Russian commanders in the Seversk direction. So, they actually know that they do this without glory. Taking this hill would, actually help the Russian tactical advantage here, but it doesn't make you as sexy as just storming these villages directly, which is what the last Russian commander did, which was not feasible, and it led to loss of lives just for prestige. So it was very bad task, but the Russians are making slow and steady progress to try to take this hill and wrestle it away from the Ukrainians, because doing so then forced the Ukrainians back to Seversk. This week, the Russians have taken these fields here near Grigorivka, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians continue trying to take, maybe try to take up this tree line, take, all these fields here. So, last week we saw the Russians take some of these things in the south here. Now we see them taking some of these things in the north here. So, they're just slowly but surely pushing the Ukrainians out of this hill here and because if they could take everything here, then they could actually take Verkhomanyanska and Grigorivka, because they are on the lowlands here. So yeah, the Seversk direction is slowly but surely now turning into the Russian favor. Alrighty, now we're going to go to one of the most interesting areas where the Russians are activated, and where the Russians are also allegedly making their plans for their new offensive, which is the Lyman direction. And this week, we talked about how the Russians made major gains in expanding their bridgehead near Ivanovka, and this week is no exception. They continued expanding it. One of the biggest changes is the Russians have completely captured the village of Katerinovka here. We actually have the Russians raising their flags here. So last week they were right on the outskirts here, so this week they took it, and they actually also took the fields to the west of here. So they took these fields right here. So that is a very major gain for the Russians. So if we look at the total scope of what they took, it'd be something like this. So a lot of big gains here. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians also take Novomykolaiivka here just to expand their positions here, and just continue pushing, north here, and try to link up with the Russians in Stepany and Kopina, and to finally liberate all of Luhansk Oblast. But in order to do so, they have to take all these villages along this road here. But I think, first of all, one of the main things the Russians are trying to do is secure their bridgehead in the south here before they continue pushing north. And to that, they have to take the village of Kolodelaski and Novi. Kolodelaski has been elusive to the Russians. They've taken the fields around it and in front of it, but they've not been able to storm it. Where in the northern part, in Novi, is actually where the Russians are making a lot of progress. And this week, the Russians have cut one of the major roads that supply Novi. Have taken this area right here, and along with this, they have taken the fields to the south here. So they've taken these fields right here. And so this encircles Novi from 3 directions. And not only that, the Russians, according to most mappers, the Russians have taken the eastern part of Novi and have positions in some of these buildings. Now, I don't know the extent of the damage of Novi. I don't know if this village has been flattened to the ground. But if these buildings are still up, the Russians could use them as, positions to hold onto Novi. And I expect it wouldn't be surprising if the Russians storm Novi this coming week and take it. With the fall of Novi, this would secure their positions in the north in a very secure area. And then from here, I expect the Russians then to try to take Kolodelsky. So the main Russian goal here will be take Novi and take Kolodelsky and take something like this. This will then they'll actually have a very solid position on this side of the Zherbets River. And then from here, this will be where the Russians push will be, indicative of their plans. Will they push northwards to try to link up here with and then try to take everything up to here? I mean, this would make, expand their bridgehead, create another huge bridgehead near Basivka, and then not only would they liberate the rest of Luhansk Oblast, this will also put them in a very good position to start storming Borova, which is another area the Russians want a major objective in this area. Or they could continue pushing near Lyman, and from here probably push southwards towards Yampil, which is also why the Russians are pushing here. I think the main goal for the Russians here is to encircle Seversk from the north, reach the village of Dornivka, so the Russians could reach Yampil, and then finally finish the battles for the Seversky Donetsk forest. And then this would allow the Russians to encircle Yampil from the south, and then from here the Russians could try to push towards the village of Shenerdkolokovko, Novoselivka, Durilovko, and try to cut off Lyman from the north. So, there's a lot of directions the Russians could take this, but the main thing is that securing a bridge here will allow the Russians to have multiple, have a very strong position, actually mold the battlefield to start battles for Borova and Lyman, which I think is the main objective for the Russian direction here. I think even the Ukrainians see it. But the main goal for the Russians is to take everything to the other side of the Oska River, take Lyman, take Borova, and then we'll see what happens from here. But taking these is essential for the Russians to be able to actually start encircling, battling for Slavansk and Kramatorsk, because this would facilitate the Russians to create a bridgehead here, and then try to cut off Slavansk and Kramatorsk. But yeah. So the Lyman, and not only that, the Russians are also pushing the south here. So, not only they're pushing northwards, they're pushing the south. Most mappers show that the northern part of Torska has been taken. So the Russians have taken these fields here. Toreska and Girani are split in half by a river. So the Russians are able to do this. This also links up with Russian positions in the Torskoye salient here, which has been a thing for like 2 years now. Near Dierbrova. So I do expect that the Russians will probably try to continue pushing south here, and we shall see if the Russians are able to take Toretska. But if they're able to take Toretska and link up something like this, then they'll be in a very good position to start maybe storming towards Yampil. Maybe they're just waiting until the Russians take Kolodosky and then continue pushing south here, along the like this, and cut off Girania and try to take this village as well. This would just push them much more further towards Lyman here. But yeah, so the Russians are very much in a good position here. And not only that, the Russians are pushing here as well. The Ukrainians did counterattacks here, but that has not stopped the Russians from pushing them back. We have geologic confirmation that the Russians have completely recaptured the village of Nadia. This village is going back and forth, but this shows that the Ukrainians don't just have the initiative here. The Russians are also pushing them back here. So the Lyman direction is coming to life. It's more alive than it's ever been in a long while. it looks like also the Russian command here has been changed. So it's kind of a miracle how that all works. You have just a change in leadership could create a lot more better places. Anyway, yeah. So that is the Lyman direction. Now let's go to the Kupiansk direction, and there's actually not been that much changes in the Kupiansk direction. The only biggest things the Russians are trying to encircle Stepova and Novoselivka from the north here. They actually took some of these fields to the north of it. I'm still surprised they have not taken this village. At least just to, I would think they would try to just improve their positions here a little bit. Maybe this is what they're doing now. Maybe they just want a distraction to pin Ukrainian positions in Kupiansk to distract them from their bridgehead in Dorichnia. But yeah, I do expect the Russians will continue. They did take some of these fields to the north, and if they're not pushed out, I do expect the Russians to take Stepova and Novoselivka finally, and make just another pressure point for the Ukrainians in Kupiansk. We also have most mappers are now saying the Russians are still mostly in control of Kalynove, which secures their northern part here. This is very essential because the Russians have been pushing south here, and the Russians pushing south here is essential if they want to start encircling Borova. So this kind of split of the Oskal defenses here needs to be secured, and holding on to Kalynove is essential for the Russians here. So we have most mappers now say that this is not under Ukrainian control. The Russians are still in control of this area. Now, in the Dorichnia bridgehead itself, there's actually just not been much changes. The main thing has been the Russians have been trying to battle for this kind of forest here in the south of Kamyanka. The Syriac map shows that they've captured most of this area, so I do expect the Russians will probably try to take this like kind of forest right here, and just to continue developing their offensive in Kamyanka here. So we shall see how that develops. But yeah, so just some battles for Kamyanka, and we shall see what happens here. Alrighty, and there's been no changes in the Kharkov direction. Yeah, no changes there as usual. Now, let us go to the final direction, which I call the Sumy direction, because now this is the where the Russians are mostly battling, and this is where the Russians are, this is where the future battles will be taking place. So in the Sumy direction, one of the biggest changes has been that the Russians have completely liberated the village of Guevo. We talked about last week how the Russians took maybe the northern half, but the battles were still ongoing, but it looks like the Ukrainians were completely pushed out of this village, and the Russians have completely liberated it. And not only that, they are now expanding their positions towards the last one of the two last villages in Kursk that the Russians have to liberate, which is Gornal. A lot of sources are saying the Russians have reached right on the outskirts of this monastery right here, which is, I think the Russians are going to try and take it because it gives them a forward position to launch into Gornal itself. Because not only have they taken Guevo, they have taken all these fields to the south of it, to the west of it, and I wouldn't be surprised. And with the position, since Gornal is along a river here, the Russians don't have to worry about the Ukrainians attacking here, or because they have a natural defense here. The Ukrainians could attack through these fields, but again, there's no actual, besides Gornal, there's no actual place where the Ukrainians could actually support their positions here. So I do expect that, especially if the Russians start pushing, towards the village of Satki. Is this even a village, or is this just a name on the map? It looks like some farmsteads or some shit. But in any case, if the Russians could actually push out of their positions here and try to, enter the Sumy, try to take some of these like forest belts here, this would greatly complicate the logistics for Garnal, and also, start battles for one of the major gains for the Russians, which is Yunatovka. But in any case, the Russians have liberated Guevo. They are now taking these fields around Kursk, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians start battling for Garnal this week. But yeah. And then in terms of this little Ukrainian Belgorod incursion, it looks like it's completely failed. The Russians have completely recaptured the village of Dnivka and Popovka. Most sources show that the Russians have not completely pushed them out of the border zone. But if the Ukrainians aren't here, then I do suppose the Ukrainians probably withdrew back to their pre-war border where they have more fortifications. But the Russians have not exactly entered these areas yet. But it does show that this area where the Ukrainians are trying to develop a position here has failed. So the Russians have retaken these two villages, and now maybe the Russians will activate here and try to push the Ukrainians and activate on this area, the Sumy direction as well. And then more in the northern part here, one of the biggest changes here is in this area. The Russians have completely captured village Zhuravka. We talked about how this happened already, but we just got confirmation this week. And one of the biggest things is the Russians have cleared the fields between Basivka and Zhuravka. So as you can see, they before these were kind of separated, but with taking the Basivka and taking the southern part of Zhuravka, it seems like they've now been able to take these fields between these villages, and this would facilitate the further movement towards Bilovodovka. Now, I think in order to take Bilovodovka, the Russians will have to continue their offensive more here. They'll have to take the village of Volodymyrivka, Novomykolaievka, Voldanovka, and take something like this. Because if once they take this, then they could take Bilovodovka, which is actually this is like Basivka. As you can see, taking Basivka is a pretty, the Russians could hold their positions here very much. But taking Bilovodovka would allow them to also accumulate more to the west here. So I think the Russian push will be something like this here so far. Yeah, so we see that happening. And obviously the main goal for the Russians is to take the village of Yonatovka, which will be a very big gain for the Russians. We also have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in Lokonovka here. We have Russians being in the northern part of Lonovka. I do think that, they won't be able to actually secure this village until I think the main purpose holding this is to push this way to take some of these fields here along this highway and then finally liberate Oleshna. It looks like the Ukrainians are holding onto this village with all their might because they do not want to lose it, because they want to hold on to Kursk Oblast as much as possible. But in any case, the Russian offensive into Sumy Oblast is ongoing. The Russians only have 2 more villages before they completely liberate Kursk, and we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly breakdown of what's been happening at the battlefield on the front line for the war in Ukraine. So if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukraine updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.